Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Center for HBCU Research Leadership and Policy. My name is Melanie Carter. I'm Associate Provost and Director of the Center, and welcome to our Turning Pages, Turning Author Talks episode. And today we welcome Dr. Eddie Cole, who is author of the Campus Color Line, College Presidents and the Struggle for Black Freedom. So welcome, Dr. Cole. We're really pleased that you're here to join us today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Dr. Carter. It's a
Absolutely.
pleasure.
Absolutely. So our Turning Pages series really focuses on works that we think are extremely important, not only to the HBCU ecosystem, but beyond. And so certainly your book uh, was widely acclaimed, is widely acclaimed, and received a lot of attention because it's really great work and really does illuminate the importance of college presidents and their role in terms of the Black freedom struggle, but really how they engage and respond to issues that affect larger society and what that means for our higher education. And so we really appreciate your work. Certainly, I read it a couple years ago, a few years ago, and certainly have used it in my course, History of Our Education, here at Howard University. And so, really looking forward to this discussion today and our conversation about this great book. And so, we really usually begin with a series of questions, of course, about the book, just broadly, to talk about, why you wrote the book, its significance, etc. So I'll begin with an opening question, which is, what inspired you to write this book, and what key experiences or influences shaped its creation?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Dr. Carter. And, first, you got to invite me to your History of Higher Ed class. I got to zoom in and talk with you next time you teach the
Oh,
book.
absolutely, positively.
My inspiration for the book is a couple of things, both personal, one from where I grew up and then one from undergrad. From where I grew up in Bowler, Alabama, it is in the west central Alabama. It's located in the Black Belt. I don't know if you're familiar with the rural Black South, but I'm a Black Belt kid. And I grew up there, and my parents were teachers in the Black Belt. And one set of my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, were also teachers in the Black Belt. So you can go back as far as think of the one-room schoolhouses. And so that's where my grandparents started their teaching careers, HBCU educated. And so education was a big deal in my family. So I always had an interest in education. Funny enough, I tried to run from education because it felt like everybody in my family did education. And so, first of all, I had a particular bias and lean and interest toward race and education because of where I grew up, my family history, et cetera, right? So I took that childhood experience and then I went to college, Tennessee State University for my undergraduate studies, Nashville. And funny enough, while I was on campus, my last 2 years, I was the editor of the student newspaper, The Meter. And that's how I ended up being introduced to a lot of my contemporaries who were at Howard at the time because they were student journalists for the Hilltop. And so I was actually quite familiar with sort of the HBCU news circles. And then, funny enough, because I was the editor of the student newspaper, as I was finishing up undergraduate, the Geyer versus Tennessee case was wrapping up. And I'm gonna say that again because my email chimed in back. So you're gonna have to edit that. Let me close my email for a second. All right. And so as I was finishing up my undergraduate studies, the Geyer versus Tennessee case was closing, which was the formal desegregation case for Tennessee public higher education. And the president of Tennessee State called me and the student government president into a meeting the day before it was announced that case was going to be closed. And he just wanted to give us two a heads up as student leaders of the significance of the case and saying that we would likely be reached out to by media for interviews because we were current students. This is me finishing undergraduate at Tennessee State. And at that point, it was a 38-year-old desegregation case. So this is even in my lifetime. So while it might feel like 1960s a long way away, the arc, the ramifications of this era and this shaping higher education in the present is real for me. And so there I was sitting with a president of a historically black college talking about desegregation in my lifetime and sort of giving us some background on it. And so it's me, my friend who's the student government president, and three vice presidents and the president talking to us. And so by the time I went on to graduate school, after graduating from Tennessee State, I went to Indiana University Bloomington for all of my graduate work. that was the area that I wanted to study. I couldn't run from I, for as much as I wanted to run from education as a kid, the topic that I wanted to study the most was really education and the history of education. And so I wanted to know more about college presidents. I wanted to know more about this desegregation. What's all that about? And so one class paper turned into another thing, then it morphed into a dissertation. And then the dissertation became the book. And now you look at it years later, we're talking about it. And so that really is the inspiration, the background, some key experiences that shaped the creation of this book. I wanted to know about more about leaders. I want to know more about education. I want to know more about race. And I found out far more than I anticipated.
One of the things I think is so compelling about this book is that oftentimes we don't think of college presidents as sort of central actors in a struggle. And I think you do a fine job of that. Certainly, my favorite chapter probably is chapter one because of the focus on Jenkins at Morgan State. And it really does weave in nicely all the historical sort of issues or society and his role writ large. I mean, and certainly he was a Howard professor. That's a great thing. But beyond that, his work in terms of with the Department of Education, the survey, I mean, just all of that really weaves together a really strong story of how his particular experiences and his own sort of lens was critically important in terms of his work as a college president, but also in terms of just thinking about how important presidents can be in shaping how we respond to or initiate particular ideas that shape policy. And so I just want to commend you on that. And which really speaks to another question around central themes or findings, because I think, again, the centrality of presidents in terms of their actions often don't often think about how central they have been or can be. And so I'm wondering, given where we are today, especially when you think about how presidents have been called upon in a variety of ways and held to account, if you will, for either defending what some might believe is the sort of academic enterprise versus what others so sort of competing beliefs about who we are as institutions across America. And I'm just wondering, how do you think your findings or some of the themes in this book might shape the broader landscape of higher education, particularly as it relates to the roles of presidents?
Yeah, Dr. Carter, that's a great observation. I appreciate you highlighting that because one thing that, as I mentioned, as a student, as a graduate student, and you read so much about higher education during this era, I like to say student activists show up often, right? We know a lot about student activism, and we're still learning more about student activism. But I like to say, so I'm gonna use an LA example since I'm at UCLA now, right? I like to say college presidents always make a cameo appearance in those histories, right? About student activism. And I wanted to know more about who are these central figures that are in every story, but they're kind of in reaction to the activism. And so that's one side. And then we hear so much about the NAACP attorneys and their role in shaping higher education. But again, college presidents make a cameo appearance. Like they pop up and then they're reacting and then they disappear. And so part of the central theme, really, the book revolves around this idea is that they weren't passive leaders of institutions of higher education. They were very much actively shaping how the institution responded. They were shaping policy. They were shaping practices, both on campuses and beyond. And I think that's kind of remarkable in a lot of ways. And in the HBCU context, leaders like Martin Jenkins, who led Morgan State, 1948 to 1970 were very strategic in trying to be low key, right? They're very strategic oftentimes in sort of taking that back seat, which is how historians have often remembered many of them. But in a lot of ways, you see they're very proactive in a lot of ways, just in how they're shaping policy. And so that's important. One, recentering and rethinking about the role of leadership. And then to your broader point around sort of, what do these themes and findings mean for where we stand today? There's so many lessons. I'll be completely frank with you. When I wrote the book, I thought it'd be for scholars, historians, and higher ed researchers, and some other people of interest. I talked to far more contemporary leaders of colleges and universities than I ever thought I would. They've read the book, they invite me to conversations, I go to their sessions and I talk to them because the things really speak to the challenges in front of them today. So in the HBCU context, there's still this ongoing tension between state government, federal government, private or public. It's not just for the public institutions, and what it means around funding, the future of funding, private sources for funding, as we see a lot of philanthropy still going to many HBCUs, alongside what's coming from the federal government or not coming from the federal government. That's a conversation that leaders are still trying to navigate today. And then when you step back in the larger context and say, why these leaders were so important. Once upon a time, there were elected officials that actually believed in expertise, in facts. And so we had these moments to where whether you were at state government or federal government, colleges and universities were seen as the place that where people could solve complex problems. So a lot of these presidents who led these institutions got tapped to sit on these formal commissions and other committees to help shape state and federal policy around a number of complex issues in society. And so this really just sort of reimagines completely the role of the presidency past and frankly present in the moment to, like you said, when higher education is under enormous attack. There's no institutional type that is immune from where things stand today. This is a moment to where a lot of contemporary leaders can look to the past for lessons about how to or how not to navigate these contentious political moments.
Oh, I love that response. And I think it's so important to understand that history, th- what behaviors or actions or that people engage in today, people will look to in the future to figure out how to move forward. And so these decisions, in terms of response or strategy, uh, these decisions are very, very important. So I really appreciate your response, and so pleased that presidents are reading your book and calling upon you for insight is critically important. And I also think about your work in terms of sort of work that is being produced now in sort of recent years um, on some of these issues. When I think, and I know you speak to this, some of this in your work, certainly. Um, Vanessa Walker's works, although she certainly speaks to the K through 12 space, but also the focus on understanding the role of Black teachers and Black organizations, and as you say, silent networks and invisible networks, I think is a very powerful descriptor in terms of talking about how important these organizations were and actually continue to be. And also, certainly beyond her work as well, Crystal Sanders' work recently, Adam Harris's work around the state must provide in terms of really looking at the lawyer's role, and others in terms of really pressing um, laws that restrict African American access. And then, of course, Jelani Favors, who's a friend of the center and a dear friend, and his work around students, as you said, this idea of activism and students and HBCUs. And these presidents are mentioned, as you said, but certainly cameo appearances, but really, really digging into how did they actually navigate this terrain is important. It really speaks to, the viability of these institutions. Certainly, we know as presidents are looked upon as being the face and the of the institution and really engaging in ways that sometimes the rest of us in these institutions don't have to. But I really appreciate not only this work, but the sort of the continuation of work that really centers and illuminates the role uh, of these critical actors and their agency, because sometimes it's minimized, and I like the centrality of that. I think is so incredibly important. So as I think about its relevancy, at the center of one of our strategic plan, really, we have a byline now that says HBCU research matters, HBCU researchers matter. And a part of this is really centering um, what we're doing from the lens of someone who is engaged with HBCUs, graduate HBCUs. You're sort of, and I always say HBCUs are not owned by people. I mean, most folks have had some contact with HBCUs, Black people in America, whether it's your teacher, your preacher, your mother, your father, your cousin. I mean, we're all influenced. And so I'm just wondering why, okay, and so why is this work relevant to HBCUs in particular?
Yeah, one, this book is actually bookend in the HBCU narrative. The first chapter and the last chapter, especially, and from very different perspectives. But really, HBCUs are the anchor of the book. You got to read between the lines, but you really see it. But that's my own sort of perspective as a scholar, my own background. One thing is relevant to HBCUs because it shows the power of HBCUs. It really amplifies Jelani Favor's work from a different perspective, right? It shows that how these institutions, the spaces, the places have been the engines for social change, transformation, without a doubt. And that perspective is studied and needs to continue to be studied from various points on the HBCU ecosystem, right? From the president's office down to the student government office to the all the points in between, what the faculty do, the role of staff, which is often overlooked in so many ways. Right? It's just this entire more system that we can point to. Many changes in America has a direct through line back to an HBCU in some kind of way. So that's one way that is relevant. The other way that is relevant, it really raises a number of questions, especially when you look at the first chapter around Martin Jenkins and his work at Morgan State and the networks among presidents and how it's less competition, during that era, and more about how do we as a collective group of institutions advance the overall mission of Black freedom and education, et cetera. So that's one way that is relevant, and you see how it's done. So the book gives insight into a blueprint that was used and deployed in a number of ways. That first chapter and how it ends, really in Fort Valley, Georgia, is really fascinating to me, and it emerges from the archives when I was at Morgan State in Baltimore, right? So I get more insight on Fort Valley, Georgia, by looking in the papers up Martin Jenkins papers in Baltimore. It gives this rich insight across institutional lines and how to use Black Teacher Association meetings, right, as sort of hallway conversations about what they do next. I just love the photograph I came across to when Willoughby Player was her inauguration as President Bennett in Greensboro, and how many other men, presidents of Black colleges, showed up at her inauguration in support of her. All those kind of things are interesting and important, past and present for HBCUs. But then a larger conversation by the time you get to the end of the book is looking at how HBCUs fit within the larger, broader higher education system, and frankly, its continued dismissal, right? Like continually being the afterthought, maybe an entry point when it's popular, but then not so much when it's not hot to be engaged with HBCUs. In the 1960s are a great example of that, to where we saw for a brief moment potential system-wide change in higher education, to where HBCUs were a focal point. When you think about the John F. Kennedy administration continued through the Lyndon B. Johnson education, for a brief moment, we saw a new world about what higher education could be. And for a brief moment, the wealthier, larger, predominantly white institutions were in support of that, from the University of Michigans to the Princetons, the Yales, the Wisconsins, et cetera. Those institutions were working in partnership with HBCUs because at a moment there was an idea to have a broader impact on higher education, and HBCUs were going to be key to that. But those larger institutions played the public relations and publicity game and quickly retracted on those partnerships and left HBCUs as a bit of an afterthought in a lot of ways. And so the book gives you so many relevant ways to think about HBCUs in terms of relationship to other institutions of higher education, also individual action of our leaders, and what it means to work across campus lines, across campus contexts, that also steer toward this singular goal, toward education and broader societal liberation, even, and it's not just limited to just sort of one institution type. HBCUs and HBCU thinkers, HBCU intellectuals actually had ideas about how to really create a better society, really to uphold the promise of democracy in a lot of ways. And by studying the presidents of HBCUs, I got a lot of insight into what that looked like in their private conversations.
I love that. And I think that's so incredibly important. And that last chapter was critical in terms of identifying ways in which that we've missed some opportunities, not only as HBCUs, but certainly the larger higher education ecosystem, sort of thinking about HBCUs and what that means in terms of democracy, freedom, access, opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think we certainly could do a better job. And I also think that higher education period in terms of thinking about how we sort of organize our thinking or think about
Mhm.
schools period, universities and colleges, sometimes not just minimize, as you said, but also completely excludes HBCUs from the conversation, as if I mean, I always say that, we certainly, HBCUs are not homogeneous, certainly is an eclectic group of institutions, and served, while they have some shared mission priorities. We certainly have had different historical experiences in terms of the institutions, different populations in terms of what region we're in, etc. I think that's very important. And also, I think that oftentimes at HBCUs, although most of us worked and attended many institutions, we forget that there isn't a deep understanding or really even a surface understanding of HBCUs beyond our institutions. And I think that is a real disadvantage too, because oftentimes we think of HBCUs as an anomaly or idiosyncratic or only,
Yeah.
as if we're all the same. And none of that is true as well. And so
Yeah.
I think we have to really work on that.
Yeah, and but that's the beauty of HBCUs, right? In that they are reflective of the broader Black America
That's right.
in a lot of
Absolutely.
ways, right? It's not a one singular approach. I think from Alabama, like I love the fact that down in Mobile you got Bishop State, right? Like
That's
you got
right.
HBCU Community College, right? And then you got Howard's, and it's
Hmm.
very different institutional types, and but serving the broader, like historically serving the broader Black citizenship
Hmm.
across all aspects of it. I think that's remarkable. And so yeah, there's no, broad stroke, all HBCUs are this.
Right.
Local context means a lot. And I think that's what's so important about the institutions themselves.
I
Is
agree.
that it like in my, I know people want to grow enrollments, et cetera, but like it's like I think there's a specific role for
I
the
agree.
smaller HBCU and the larger ones and the private and the public ones and the ones in cities and the ones that are seemingly in the middle of nowhere. I think all of them serve a unique role for sure.
And I agree with you. And I think part of the challenge, though, is because we're often competing, not only HBCUs, but other institutions, for what people want us to believe are scarce resources. Then we try to become something that we were never intended to be. And we're thinking that um, sort of uh, goal to become something else is serving our communities. I think we need to really figure out. I think we've done that. Certainly, HBCUs have been successful for a whole host of reasons. So I don't want to at all detract from the ways in which HBCUs have been consistently successful. But I do want to say is that this race to become, a particular kind of institution, I think we have to really pause and figure out what that means for all of us in terms of our institutions, in terms of our communities, in terms of our future. Because just like there are wonderful small liberal arts universities, colleges, and universities that stand on that, I think that we should continue to stand on who we are, who we serve, and institutions that we need to be in order to best continue to do the work that we're doing. So I agree with that completely. So I'm wondering too. Now you've talked about being called upon by presidents and others to really share some insights based upon your research. Are there any uh, insights in particular that you think HBCU leaders or other leaders um, might be interested in sort of learning about or applying to their own sort of leadership framework, if you will?
Yeah, yeah, I think about this often also. There's so much to be learned from the past, yeah, but that's my bias as a historian of higher ed. But in one way, like HBCU leaders, something that I write about in the book is about the role of the university to its neighboring bordering community. And I write about that historically from the perspective of large, predominantly white institutions that are really displacing thousands of Black households. Think about the University of Chicago's, the Columbia Universities in New York, the University of Pennsylvania, West Philly. You can go down the list. I write about the role of college presidents in really shaping federal housing policy that displaced so many, especially Black households in major cities across the United States. But if you fast forward to sort of what lessons can contemporary leaders take from that, as you see HBCUs grow today to these extremely large enrollments, right? I think about A&T down in Greensboro. We know about East Greensboro. Howard in DC has an ongoing changing neighborhood dynamics. The contemporary HBCU leader has to think, what does growth look like and at what cost? Because it's one thing for Yale to displace a Black community. You see the racial dynamics there of the large white university displacing predominantly Black neighborhoods in New Haven. But what does it mean for HBCUs that are located often within Black communities, right? I think about this with my own alma mater, Tennessee State. Nashville is a particular place, and North Nashville has a unique Black history. I was at homecoming this, this year, and it's amazing how things look different. And what is the role of the university in that change? A lot of it is city policy, but what conversation are the academic leaders having at our institutions with city government as well about these changes, neighborhoods changing, et cetera? So that's one thing that leaders can think about, sort of insights from the past that they have to be mindful because, again, the relationship between the HBCU and the community is unique, it's distinctive, it's not reflective in any other institutional type. So if, to your point, Dr. Carter, if you start modeling your HBCU leadership off of what it looks like at other institutions, that's a different dynamic when it comes to engaging the neighborhood. So that's one takeaway. I think it's something else for policymakers, and I like to say this for private philanthropy as well. Another thing to consider is where where does the genuine aspect of giving begin and stop, right? At what point is something a press release, and at what point is something like genuine long-term investment? I think this is going to be critical to where things are going. You can look at how the economy tends to be trending right now. You can look at how federal dollars are certainly uncertain, to say the least, in higher education. I noticed the Department of Education, as it still exists, just reclassified professional degrees and what that means for student loans. And Tennessee State, my undergraduate alma mater, has a phenomenal and large booming nursing program. So, what does that mean in terms of who can afford to pursue a nursing degree? What does that mean for the industry? So, when you have institutions like HBCUs that serve particular, historically serve particular communities and have disproportionately educated Black Americans or Black people generally, not just Black Americans, you have to think in a lot of ways about what these policy changes mean in a lot of ways, and we have to be mindful of that. Those of us who are alumni, those of us who work at HBCUs, et cetera, we got to be mindful of these policy changes and what they mean for the institution. And hopefully, our leaders are involved in those conversations as well, pushing back on a lot of things. I mean, I could go down a list in a lot of ways around sort of, what insights and lessons contemporary leaders can take from the book. Really, and especially in this current political context, you think a lot about speech, free speech, and what you can and can't say, and the risk of speech and what ramifications come with saying some things on campus. And is academic freedom and free speech, are they protected? Are they not protected? What does that look like? These are different, similar yet different times. And we have to be mindful of what lessons are applicable from the past that can give insight into the present. But we also have to be mindful of the unique dynamics that are in front of us right now that don't quite mirror apples to apples, oranges to oranges to the past. And so there's a lot. Here's the one thing that I say all the time to academic leaders. I asked them by a show of hands. You can imagine there's a room of 30, 40, and sometimes 100 executive level leaders of colleges. And I asked them by a show of hands, how often do you meet, how many of you meet on a regular basis with like your vice presidents or chief financial office? And every hand goes up, every president, of course I meet with my finance people. I say, how often do you have a standing meeting with someone who's like your student affairs vice president or dean of students? And their hands go up. Of course, I always have a meeting with, administrators. Then I say, how often do you meet with your campus librarian or archivist? And hardly no one's hand goes up, right? And I say, there sits an issue in the sense of many of the challenges before us. For as much as we like to think we're special, for as much as we like to think that we're unique, a lot of these challenges have been grappled with before by your predecessors. And if you took just 30 minutes a week or 30 minutes every couple of weeks to actually take some time and read through the archives, even the old president's papers, or go to the campus and look through the old student newspapers, you might see some themes that feel eerily similar to challenges facing you right now today. And you'd be better served if you had that larger contextual understanding of your institution, its community, and what that means for you moving forward right now today.
Wow. I love that response. It's so true and so eloquent. I tell my higher ed students that the reason why we take history of higher education is because as a leader, you need to know when a situation is a crisis and when it is not. And one of the things that studying history helps you to understand is that most of these things we've encountered before. That doesn't mean that they not might not be serious issues, but they're not brand new typically. And so I love your response, and I think that's so important for there to be some grounding in history of the institution or the folks who led before them. I love that. In my office, I have a large picture of Du Bois with Horseman Bond um, and with Mary McLeod Bethune. And they were at an address, I believe it was at Lincoln.
Mm,
And I like that photo. And another large photo I have, a large frame, is in a small colored schoolhouse that you described earlier when you talked about your grandparents. I believe it's in Alabama. I say that about the picture of Du Bois and Horseman Bond and Mary McLeod Bethune, three giants in higher ed history, certainly as it relates to HBCUs and beyond, is that their work beyond their work as presidents. I mean, certainly Bethune's influence on federal policy and she was a club woman, a networker beyond. What most people were doing. Certainly, Du Bois, in terms of his influence, not only as a scholar, but in terms of really challenging social um, limitations and illuminating the ways in which Black people were, certainly dehumanized, mistreated, ignored in terms of their contributions. Certainly, Horace Mann Bond in terms of his leadership of HBCUs and beyond. So again, the way you've woven all of this in your book, and not only in terms of that kind of work. We're talking about the associations and professional groups that they were involved with, and also, what that means in terms of presidents at universities everywhere in terms of the decisions they make. I love the chapter about was that we can't operate in slums or we can't. Chapter two,
yeah.
and when I read that, in terms of University of Chicago and the others, I often think about. I worked at Clark Atlanta. I'm a graduate of Clark Atlanta. I thought about Clark Atlanta for years. How the John Hope homes were certainly. Removed and the university was able to expand in some ways, but what that really meant, what that means in DC, as you said, what that means in all, we can on and on and on when you talk about in Tallahassee and so forth. And so I think these issues in terms of how we respond or how our leaders think about the decisions and what that means for the institutions right then and also beyond is so incredibly important. I really appreciate the way you really um, discussed that or really showed how those decisions what the impact they have for us in the future. So again, I appreciate that. So I'm wondering, all this conversation right now about equity, diversity, leadership, what that means, and when you talked about some of these, even for me, and I consider myself a brave person and an advocate, and I'm really willing in many ways. Well, can't be willing, let me just not have any kind of um, sort of descriptor there, to speak truth to power. I mean, in this space, that's essential. I mean, because if we don't, um, more and more of these things that we've thought of as being so critically important to intellectual engagement. I mean, just asking important questions and having debates that matter, right? And challenging orthodoxy. All those things are important. And I'm just wondering, in terms of thinking about this book and the presidents that you examine their decisions, what kind of lessons about those things, how to speak truth to power, how to be brave, and perhaps even how to ensure that your institution survives a time of uncertainty? What about that?
Yeah, there are a few presidents in the book that is very clear to me that they led with a very strong moral compass, which I think when we think about leadership today, I don't hear that as much. Perhaps we hear that if you were leading a private religious institution today, but across the board, that was pretty common to hear such a reference or very evident in their leadership, and was clear from the most courageous leaders of the mid 20th century, so the 1950s and 1960s. The most courageous leaders really saw the job of leadership as temporary in the sense of they were willing to lose their job if so be it, as long as they were making decisions that they felt were ethically, morally just for the institution and for the students. This really is really fascinating. And I think that is something for us to think about a lot today in the sense of what my observation when I look at a lot of leaders of institutions today is that they are a bit more timid than their predecessors were. I'm not saying that all presidents in the 50s and 60s were spot on, courageous, and burn it down. We know that's not the case. But the ones we remember are clearly courageous. Like we can talk about Benjamin Elijah Mays today. We talk about Willoughby B. Player today. I'm not quite sure if 40, 50 years from now, we're talking about the current leaders in the same way that we talk about these dynamic leaders from back then, the way we remember them 50, 60, 70 years later, right? Mary McLeod Bethune, for instance, right? And so I think that is a very interesting aspect of where things stand right now in the sense of there's a certain level of I'm willing to do this job. I'm committed to the institution, but I'm not going to go so far as I'll do anything to keep my job if it may be to the disadvantage or harm to the students of the institution. Most times you saw people willing to thread the needle and say, I'm not going to go that far because it's going to hurt the students. I'm not going to go that far because I think I'm best person for this position because I'm still committed to it. It's a very interesting dance. And what we see now, publicly, but also what you hear even privately, you don't see as many leaders willing to do that. And maybe that's a compensation thing. I don't know. Maybe leaders are getting paid so much now that they're just like, I don't want to give up this presidency. I don't know. Sort of the rationale behind some decisions that we've seen and so many leaders that seem to be going along when it comes to state or federal demands in a lot of ways. But maybe some of that private networking, silent networking is still happening today. Hopefully it is for the positive. But the overall takeaway in terms of where equity stands and what we should expect of leaders, you've got to be able to say, what does this look like in reality, right? Not just what it looks like on a strategic plan, not just what it looks like in a statement sent out to the entire campus, but what does it look like in terms of what people feel on the ground? Something that I talk about quite often in all my talks about this book is understanding the social history of an institution, not just the institutional history. And the institutional history is the high level stuff. You can say when a campus was founded, you can say when it, earned university status, or maybe when the med school was established, or this program, that program, accreditation year. That's institutional history. But I'm from Bowler, Alabama, and I grew up less than an hour from the University of Alabama. I don't have a single memory of a recruiter from the University of Alabama coming to my rural, predominantly Black frankly, all black high school to recruit any of us. I don't have that memory. Maybe they did, but I just don't remember it. But I don't think that was the case. And so the University of Alabama was never an institution on my radar for a place where I want to go. I say that because my community had a history and understanding of what equity meant for us on that campus. And so leaders today have to understand what it means in practice. I don't care what the university says. I know what my community understands. And HBCU leaders and all leaders have to understand that same thing in this current moment. Is what we're saying matching with what the communities we're trying to recruit from know of us? Because that is stronger than the institutional history. That is stronger than what the university puts out on the social media channels. The reality, the actual experience on the ground is going to be so critical today for leaders, policymakers, etc., to say that in this moment, when efforts around equity were challenged, what did your institution actually do? Not what did it say, what did it actually do? Because I can say in real time, I know I'm on a campus all the time. I'm teaching right now this this fall. I know what the students feel in their day-to-day on a college campus. And it doesn't matter what you email to them. It doesn't matter what you say in the State of the University address. It's about what happens on the ground. What are people feeling? What is the community feeling? What are they saying when they go back home for the break, right? That is what is probably the most critical thing that's going to determine the future of higher ed for us right now. Because as public perception of higher education continues to dwindle at large, if our institutions are like, if we just put our head down and stay quiet and do nothing, maybe we'll get over this. If you sit back and stay quiet and stay silent and fall to the back, the public perception is going to only worsen to where people are not going to be invested in saying these institutions are not the through way for me to get to a better life. It has to be another way. And so we're at a critical inflection point in American higher education right now. And it's not, again, no institution type is immune. Frankly, no location is immune. From east to west coast, north to south, urban, rural, whatever you want to call it, everybody's at this turning point to where what is the future of the university? And so I have nothing but full focus on what our leaders do to now because it's going to give us the insight into what our future looks like in America at large, not just on college campuses.
Wow. And I'm wondering, well, I'm gonna tell you, I have about a gazillion questions I could ask. I'm gonna really try, okay, to constrain myself because I think you raised so many important points right there. But I'm wondering, given what you've just said, then what, how can HBCUs respond in this moment, or what is it that our stakeholders, our communities are looking for from us? I mean,
Yeah.
right now, as you mentioned, public perception, public support of higher education is dwindling. But and there's this conversation that more and more folks are coming to black folks are coming to HBCUs because they're considered to be safe spaces. Even though we have some empirical evidence of that, but not really. It's not consistent, certainly across institutions. But I believe just that there's something to that. I'm just wondering, what do you think that is? And then, if that is the case, what is our responsibility to people who are looking for us for something?
Yeah, it kind of speaks to what you said earlier in the sense of HBCUs have to be who HBCUs are, right? And for a lot of ways, despite the struggles, you got to be your realest self, right? And so communities are looking for presence, right? And this is what I say this, especially when I'm talking to leaders of predominantly white institutions. I was like, oh, we love to say we got community partners, but then the campus creates a strategic plan and then says, community partner, here's how you fit into the plan, right? That's that approach within sort of the larger, broader approach to higher education. HBCUs have always been sort of in lockstep with the community, right? So what does the community need? Where does our recruiting pockets, where they come from, what are they looking for? Stay locked in on that. So that's one thing, right? You got to say, this not to pick on Howard, right? But it's like, oh, everyone want to be this major research university, et cetera. Okay, great. A&T is sort of trending the same way. We want to be this sort of research status. And what does that mean for you and your particular institution, right? That's just a question. You got to be able to answer that. I'm not the president of Howard. I'm not the, chancellor of A&T. Like you got to answer that question, but what does that actually mean? Okay, that's one thing. The second thing that I say as stakeholders are really looking forward to is communication and transparency. Like people really need to know what's going on. Like if things are not perfect, you don't have to get into the details of the audit, but you can say we're in a precarious position right now, and we really need alumni support in these kind of ways because here's where things stand. You got to be able to say what it is because people want to rally behind the institution. That's one way. But also, HBCUs, as you see with Martin Jenkins, who actually testified before Congress and called out racial segregation, we've got to see leaders, especially of HBCUs, who are willing to call out basic facts of what it is. If Martin Jenkins can stand up before Congress and testify against racial segregation about all of his problems in a segregated state, leading a public institution during Jim Crow, what does that say about leaders in 2025 who are also not doing those things? It's kind of interesting to me. And that's not to say every HBCU leader has to do that, but somebody has to stand up and say it. And who that person going to be, I'm really curious about who emerges as the leader of our institutions that actually calls out basic fact in this sort of post-truth era where if you say one thing and I say another thing, we just agree to disagree and nobody agrees on the truth. In this moment, you got to be able to stand up and state the basic facts. Tennessee State, again, my undergrad alma mater, you see where things stay in terms of how much the state has withheld funding from a public land grant historically black institution for decades. You got to be able to also say we need this from the budget while also acknowledging what the history is also and why we are largely in this situation. And so those are, you're going to get me going down a whole list of things. I said three or four things already, but that's just some things that come to mind first around what can be done, what people are looking for from HBCUs, our institutions, and what we should expect of leaders right now, today in 2025.
Absolutely. And I think that's so important. And thank you so much for that response because I think it does provide some insight in terms of because oftentimes we don't know how to operationalize. We know we want something, but actually saying, articulating what that is, I think your examples are extremely important and so critical. Now, we are the HBCU Center and we focus on research. And so, one of the things that I want to ask you, the final question really is around what research do you think is going to be critical for us as we move, as we're in this space and beyond? I mean, I love this book. Your book is one of my favorites in terms of history of education and really um, how it should shape or provides insight into contemporary issues, particularly around leadership. But one of your favorite pieces that I have is around your historiography. That you do a journal article that really lays out the history of Black educational, gives some Black educational history. I love. You talk about some things that we should be looking at, what sort of research we might engage as we move forward. So, could you talk about some of that, or where you see some gaps or opportunities in terms of research about HBCUs as we move forward?
Yeah, Dr. Carter, you make me blush a little bit. I'm glad I'm glad you, especially that historiography. I'm glad you were able to get
I
into
love
that. People always say labor of love. That was a very long piece.
meticulous, well done is
Yeah,
outstanding.
thank you so
Mhm.
much, and give a lot of credit for one of my doctoral students who's a Morehouse graduate who co-authored that with me. So future, sort of where we should be thinking, like future areas of research. Um, I'm gonna say something historical first because I think we don't have a full understanding. Like we need a fuller understanding of history. I really the beautiful thing about writing a book is that you see the books that come after yours and you say, "Oh wow, ooh, that's interesting." That like you mentioned, Crystal Sanders' work afterwards, like. Martin Jenkins was involved with those scholarships that Maryland was giving to Black residents to go out of state. And Crystal Sanders was like, let me just did a full book on it. I think that kind of stuff is there. We've got the future research, we have to be able to read between the lines of the histories that exist. So we have to look at what's already out there and pick up that, right? Sort of get into the details. we're in, I think, a wonderful moment around Black educational history in terms of access to sources and ability to travel to different places that a previous generation of scholars just didn't have the capacity or the resources to do the type work that many of us are able to do now. So we're about to, I think we're in a very exciting time in terms of Black higher education history. Like new stuff is coming, new questions are being asked that just builds upon what, the towering figures like the Vanessa Siddle Walkers or the James Andersons, what they've done. I'm just excited about that. So, one, history, I think, I firmly believe is part of where we need to go and do more of. So, just think broad in terms of history. Um, but some details, sort of a detail. Oh, I would love to see a few studies that probably do more than I did with regard to partnerships between the HBCUs, the whole 1950s, 1960s, those partnerships, that era. I gave it a chapter in my book, but I think there's more there. I know Brown and Tougaloo still have at least an active website around their partnership. I want to know more about that, actually. I'm really curious about that because on the surface, that looks like wealthier institutions were helping poor, smaller Black institutions. But in reality, it was an equal exchange in a very interesting way. That too bad that predominantly white institutions sort of backed out of that, reneged on those efforts because in a lot of ways, those institutions were recruiting students who were not white for the first time in bulk. They had a few, but they were recruiting students that were not white for the first time. And who better to advise them on how to educate students from these different backgrounds than the HBCUs, right? uh, it was much more to it than just this back and forth. So I would love to see more work. Like that's somebody that sounds like a great thesis or a dissertation or a potential first book for somebody. Because I can point you toward archives for all that kind of stuff. Like that would be really interesting. You talk about a project to take on for, Center for HBCU Research, Leadership, and Policy. I mean, that would be very fascinating. And you could even make policy recommendations for what that would look like in the future. So that's one thing. I think another thing is looking at institutional history. I think there are institutional histories that were published like as a one-off. They might be out of stock, out of print. I think some institutional histories can be rich. I got on my shelf, I always got Rayford Logan's History of Howard, the first 100 years. It's just just miraculous type work. I love to see people pick up those type histories in the last 50 years. What does that look like? I'd love to see a history of Morgan. I spent so much time at Morgan. I want to know more about Morgan when it went from Morgan College private to Morgan State College public, like that transition. Sort of the HBCUs that are now publics that started as privates. That'd be very interesting. Jackson State, Morgan, like that's an interesting study for me. I mean, it is, and then you see in the historiography that I published with one of our doctoral students. Like there's so much more that we need to know in terms of Black intellectual contributions as well. Du Bois, we know Atlanta University, like that's a great one. But there's so many other great Black thinkers that have shaped the world. Has somebody written like a biography of Rayford Logan? Like I don't know. I don't know. Maybe.
I
Yeah.
think there is one,
Okay.
but yeah, I think I love that idea about intellectual histories.
Yeah,
Hmm.
like the Logans and the Luther Porter
Hmm.
Jackson seniors of the world, the father, not the son who became the president. Like these are great scholars that published a lot and
That's
left.
right.
They've got writings and things to pull their ideas from, and I think this is interesting, and that really dovetails nicely with Crystal Sanders' work because you look at
Yes.
where they went to undergrad, but then looked at where a lot of them went to graduate school.
Yep.
This is a very interesting and exciting time in terms
Mhm.
of thinking deeply about the future
That's
of research and Black higher education. Because frankly, I think the key to future survival is going to be dependent upon looking back to those thinkers and pulling from those ancestors and looking at how they navigated something as gruesome and as violent as Jim Crow and what that means for us and what our seemingly very comfortable positions
That's
that
right.
we're in today. It doesn't take long for society to regress, as we know from global history. And so I think it's even more pressing now than ever to have these type conversations, to record and to post them, and hopefully one person listening feels inspired to take on a new project.
Right, right. Well, that's a wonderful way to close, and I couldn't agree more. I think this is an extremely exciting time for Black educational history, and certainly your work is evidence of that. So again, thank you so much for participating in Turning Pages, and thanks everyone for joining us. Again, I'm Melanie Carter, Director of the Center for HBCU Research, Leadership, and Policy here at Howard University, and thank you for joining us. Have a great day.